Good morning, church. You can take your seats. It's good to see you all this morning. Hopefully you know by now that February at ECCI is our Wellbeing Month, and we have a range of training and sermons which are really touching on the subject of wellbeing here at ECCI. And Pastor Doug led that last week, asking us the question, what do we see? And there was a mirror on the side here, and some of us came up and put a little sticker on the mirror of what we see when we observe ourselves. And I'm going to follow that message on this morning, asking the question, who am I? Really thinking about our identity. And our identity, if you like, is formed of two parts. We have an external and an internal identity. And the external identity is what you see in me. So I'm standing up here this morning. You will observe that I'm female, that I'm white. You might be able to try to put me into an age bracket. Let's not go there. Some of you will know my name. Some of you will know that I am the administrator at ECC. You might have thoughts about me. I can tell you some of my hobbies and the things that I enjoy. So that's my external identity. That's how you perceive me. Then I have an internal identity, my core identity, and that's how I perceive myself. And my internal identity is made up of things like whether I see myself as introverted or extroverted, and how that causes me to engage with the world around me. My internal identity is made up of my moral beliefs. It's made up of my sense of strength and my sense of insecurity. My internal identity is made up of my greatest passions and my biggest fears. And you might not consciously think about your identity as you're doing your day-to-day life and going about, doing the things that you do. But subconsciously, your identity is informing you all of the time about the places that you feel safe and the places that you don't. The people that you think are safe and the people that you think aren't. And your capability in the world, the things you think you're good at and the things that you're not. Our subconscious identity can, if you like, create an internal monologue in us which constantly informs us about our place in the world. And our identity is formed throughout our life, but primarily in our formative years as children. And there are things that we can go through in life that can cause our identity at times to grow and to shrink. Our identity can, in some ways, be quite malleable, quite pliable. But it's majorly grown in our formative years. And there are a number of things that can impact us in our identity and how we see ourselves. So, for example, the family that you grew up in will have an impact on your identity. And even the family that your primary caregivers grew up in will have an impact on your identity. Excuse me. Your ethnicity will have an impact on your identity. Your age will. Your socio-economic status can have an impact on your identity. Your access and level of education can have an impact on how you see yourself. So can your ability to assimilate comfortably into society. Our identities are formed through a wide range of experiences and encounters throughout our life. And for some people who have had particularly negative encounters in their life, their identity can become distorted and misinformed by a poor sense of self. We live in a sinful world, and I'm sure everyone in this room has a story, or some of us have more than one story, of how our lives have been negatively impacted by someone or something else. And like I said, those stories can become part of our identity, and we will struggle to see ourselves how Christ sees us. And that misinformed identity carries us and pushes us through the world in our ability to relate to ourselves, to relate to others, and to relate to God. So we're going to have a look at some examples of how this happens in the Bible this morning. And the first person we're going to have a look at is Leah. And the story I'm going to read of Leah is found in Genesis chapter 29 from verses 16 to 30. And this is what it says. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The older daughter was named Leah, and the younger one was Rachel. There was no sparkle in Leah's eyes, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and a lovely face. Since Jacob was in love with Rachel, he told her father, "I'll work for you for 7 years if you'll give me Rachel, your younger daughter, as my wife." "Agreed," Laban replied. "I'd rather give her to you than anyone else. Stay and work with me." So Jacob worked 7 years to pay for Rachel, but his love for her was so strong that it seemed to him but a few days. Finally, the time came for him to marry her. "I have fulfilled my agreement," Jacob said to Laban. "Now, give me my wife so I can sleep with her." So Laban invited everyone in the neighborhood and prepared a wedding feast. But that night, when it was dark, Laban took Leah to Jacob and he slept with her. When Jacob woke up in the morning, it was Leah. "What have you done to me?" Jacob raged at Laban. "I worked 7 years for Rachel. Why have you tricked me?" "It's not our custom here to marry off a younger daughter ahead of a firstborn," Laban replied. "But wait until the bridal week is over, then we'll give you Rachel too, provided you promise to work another 7 years for me." So Jacob agreed to work 7 more years. A week after Jacob had married Leah, Laban gave him Rachel too. So Jacob slept with Rachel too, and he loved her much more than Leah. He then stayed and worked for Laban the additional 7 years. So this is the story of Leah, and the Bible gives us an external identity of Leah that we can immediately draw some relational cues from. So Leah, we are told, is the daughter of Laban. And you get this picture of Laban in the story of being quite a greedy and self-centered man. That's the environment that she grew up in. Then we get some further identities. She is the elder sister, and the Bible describes her as having weak eyes. Then we get this picture of her younger sister Rachel, who is described as beautiful in her face and her figure. And I'm going to have to use a bit of creative license here to dig into my point this morning, but I wonder what it was like for Leah as the elder daughter, perhaps walking in her sister's shadow. I wondered what it was like for Leah to be around this sister and everybody was taken aback by her beauty, but Leah had nothing special to speak of in herself. I wonder how that impacted Leah's sense of identity. She potentially could have carried a sense of inferiority being around her sister. She may have had a sense of low self-esteem. And when you carry those kind of characteristics, you can almost develop a sense of shame and a sense of guilt for not being enough. So imagine that is what Leah is carrying in her heart. And then her father does something to her which I think is deeply abusive. We know that Jacob loved Rachel. The moment he sets his eyes on her, the Bible said that he fell in love with her and he wanted her to be his wife. And in the dark of night, when Jacob was expecting Rachel to come into the room, Laban put Leah there, and Jacob consummated his marriage with the wrong woman. And in the morning, he wakes up and he turns over in the bed expecting to see Rachel, who's beautiful in every way, and he sees Leah with the weak eyes. And Leah must have known the moment that Jacob set eyes on her, his shock and his disappointment. How do you think that impacted her sense of self? And if she wasn't sure in that moment, she then hears Jacob going to her father and saying, "You've tricked me. This isn't the woman I've worked 7 years for. This isn't the woman I fell in love with when I set my eyes on her. What have you done to me?" Leah is openly rejected by her husband. Leah's sense of identity is probably crushed in this moment. She thought before that she wasn't enough, but now she's heard it and she knows. And the Bible gives us a picture of the pain that she's carrying when she starts to bear children for her husband. She has a son and calls him Reuben, saying, "Surely the Lord has looked upon my affliction and now my husband will love me. But it appears like nothing changes because some time passes and she has another son and she calls him Simeon, saying, because the Lord has heard I was hated, he has given me another son. And it seems like nothing changes because some time passes and she has a third son and she calls him Levi, saying, this time my husband will be joined to him because I have borne him 3 sons. You can hear the pain in Leah, almost trying to find an identity in bearing her husband children. She knows she's got no external characteristics to warm herself to him. So she's trying to gain his love by bearing him these children. Then the Bible gives us this time lapse where Leah stops bearing children, and Leah and Rachel both give their husband their slaves to have children with. And then Leah's womb is opened again. This is the 6th son that she's borne her husband. And she has her 6th son and calls in Zebulun, saying, God has presented me with a special gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor because I have borne him 6 sons. 6 sons later, Leah has borne her husband children, but she has never had his heart. And I wonder whether you relate to the story of Leah this morning. Perhaps you felt like you've always walked in the limelight. Perhaps you feel like there's nothing about you that draws people to you and you feel a sense of being inferior. Perhaps when you look in the mirror, you feel like Leah with no special characteristics about yourself. Perhaps you relate to the fact that Leah was in an abusive situation. Her dad treated her really unfairly and put her in a situation where she was potentially taken advantage of. Perhaps you relate to having a husband that doesn't see you. Perhaps you relate in this story to a sense of feeling invisible. Leah's name means weary. And I wonder how many of us in the room today are weary of trying to prove who we are, trying to be seen for who we are, trying to be loved for who we are. Identity doesn't just affect women, it affects men too. In Acts chapter 7, from verses 20 to 22, it says this: at that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in speech and action. Moses is quite an interesting story, and hopefully we all know the story of Moses here, because I'm not going to go into it in detail. But he was the child of a Hebrew, and the Hebrews, when he was born, were in slavery in Egypt. And Moses' parents, in an attempt to save him, put him in the River Nile. And one day, Pharaoh's daughter comes along and finds this baby and falls in love with him and decides to take him to the palace and bring him up as her own. And I wonder what kind of complexities these created for Moses. He knew that he was a Hebrew child. He knew that his people were being ill-treated. He knew that his people were in slavery. But Moses has been put in this position where he's in the palace and he's been afforded great wealth and great education, something that his people could only dream of. And I wonder how he straddled that dual world, knowing that he belonged there, but he found himself here. And I wonder how he was accepted by the Hebrew people that looked on and thought, what makes you special, Moses? How did you get into the palace? And I wonder how well he was accepted by the Egyptians, thinking, you're not one of us, you're one of our slaves. And now you're sitting at the king's table. I wonder how it affected Moses' sense of self to be living this kind of dual life. And again, the Bible gives us a little bit of insight, because the first thing we see Moses doing as an adult is looking out of his bedroom window and seeing this Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And Moses is moved with anger, and he leaves his room and he goes out and looks around, and he's absolutely certain that no one sees him, and he kills this Egyptian and buries him in the sand. And the next day he sees 2 Hebrew people, his own people, fighting, and he goes up to them and says, guys, don't treat each other like that. And they turn on him and say, who made you our ruler and judge? We saw what you did yesterday. We don't accept your leadership. And the next day, Moses finds out that Pharaoh knows, and Pharaoh has put out a death warrant against Moses' life for his second time. So Moses flees to the land of Midian. And I wonder what went through Moses' mind as he was in the land of Midian. He's now been rejected by the Hebrews and rejected by the Egyptians. And I would imagine that throughout his childhood, his Hebrew parents said to him, Moses, you're special. God saved you. You've been set apart for something amazing. And I wonder whether he had the same narrative from his Egyptian family. Moses, the God saved you. They've set you apart. They've brought you to the palace. How did Moses process that when he was in the land of Midian, a foreign land? Did he feel like a failure? Did he feel like he'd squandered all of the wealth and the opportunity that had been afforded to him? I wonder how that impacted his sense of identity. And again, the Bible gives us a picture of that, because a good few years later, God comes on the scene and approaches Moses through a burning bush and calls him and says, actually, Moses, you have been set apart. You are special. I have called you to set your people free. But we get this picture that Moses no longer believes in himself. And in Exodus between chapter 2 and chapter 6, Moses gives no less than 6 excuses as to why he is not qualified to help God free the people. He says to God, who am I that I should go? What if they don't listen to me or believe me? I've never been eloquent. Please, Lord, send someone else. If the Israelites won't listen to me, why would Pharaoh? I speak with faltering lips. And since I speak with faltering lips, why would Pharaoh listen to me? And these are different conversations that Moses had with God throughout a period of time when God is showing Moses who he is and his power. But Moses no longer believes in himself. And maybe you're here this morning and you relate to the story of Moses. Perhaps you grew up in a dual world and you wasn't quite sure of your fit. Perhaps it created a bit of an impact in your identity and knowing who you were. Or perhaps you were given great opportunity and you felt like you've wasted it. You feel like you are a failure and you feel like there's no more opportunity for you. Leah felt inferior, unworthy, and invisible. Moses felt a sense of rejection and failure. I grew up gripped by fear, and I've asked my mum permission to share some of this story with you this morning. The home that I grew up in was very volatile and full of anger. When I was a small child, my dad got involved in a cult, and as a family, we were expected to adhere to the strict rules of that cult. So if we ever watched television, listened to music, celebrated birthdays, Christmas or Easter, or did anything that was remotely worldly in my father's eyes, there would be a price to pay. When I was a small child, I saw my dad as strict and angry and distant. And I very quickly learnt that the way for me to survive was to make myself small and to hide. In contrast to that, my mum had had a very traumatic childhood, and she escaped her childhood home at 16 years old. When she escaped, she took with her unhealed trauma and hidden shame. And it was inevitable that as parents carrying their own pain, that pain gets poured out onto the children. My mother was overprotective and very fearful, always warning me about the dangers of people, places, and things. My dad was also very fearful in terms of us doing things that would make us sinful or worldly. And as a childhood, when I reflect back now, it felt like my childhood was all about keeping rules and avoiding dangers. And at a very young age, I realised that the world was not a safe space for me. But conversely, because of the complexity in my family, my home didn't feel like a safe place either. And as a child, I grew up bound by fear. When I was about 11 years old, my dad became a Christian, and I have to say that I had a great relationship with my dad. He completely changed when he became a Christian, and we started coming to this church in the mid-80s. But I really struggled to trust God, because when I read the Bible, all I could hear and see was that angry God, the God that had so many rules and regulations, that felt burdensome for me, that had bound me my whole life. And I didn't know how I could ever please or serve a God that was angry and a rule keeper. And so I kept God at arm's length. As I grew up, I went through periods of depression and anxiety. I went through a few years where I had really severe insomnia, and I got about 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night. I used to have panic attacks. I was a mess. I was so scared of everyone and everything. But you know, I kept coming to church, and I would hear people talk about God and worship God. And I used to think, how do they see God in a way that I don't? What have I missed? And I kept pushing through. And I really became to question things about my core identity, how I viewed myself, how safe I felt around other people, and how I felt around God. And I began to hunger for change. I began to hunger for truth. I began to hunger for peace in my life, and I began to hunger for breakthrough with God. I got tired of living in insecurity and boundaries that I couldn't keep. And God has done an amazing work in my life. The fact that I am standing up here talking to you this morning is just part of what God has done in my life. God has done an amazing healing in my life. And when I worship, I struggle to contain my emotion, because I'm so grateful, because I know the person that I used to be, and I know how he has transformed me. And God can transform you too if you relate to anything I've said this morning. I just want to leave you with 4 elements that I think have really impacted my world and been a catalyst to change for me. And the first will be no surprise. The first has been prayer. And there was a season when I kept saying to God, God, I don't want you just to be my God. I want you to be my Father. And I want you to take me by the hand like a father would take his child, and I want you to walk with me. I want you to talk to me. I want you to train me up like you would literally train your child. And I began to cry out to God to reveal himself to me as my Father. And I had to fully surrender to him to be able to do that. I had to expose shame. I had to expose really uncomfortable parts of me that I so desperately tried to hide. I wore this mask because I didn't want people to know how broken I actually was. And I had to reveal those parts of myself to God. And those weren't pretty prayers. They weren't eloquent prayers. They were messy, snotty, horrible tears. The more I opened up my heart to God, the more I allowed him into those broken and hidden parts of me, the more I saw him as my Father, and the more I fell in love with him. And I trust God. I don't hold anything back from God in my life. God knows everything about me. Nothing is hidden. The second thing I did was really poured myself into the Word of God. I used to read my Bible and I'd daydream through it, and I'd walk away and I hadn't known what I read, and I knew that I needed to get into the Word. So I researched ways that I could read the Word and get it in me, read the Word and have it transform me. And we've actually got a page on our website under the prayer page that will give you tips and advice on how to get the Word in you. But the Word is transformational. It is light and life to those who read it. So I had to be intentional about reading the Word with new eyes and getting a picture of God. I knew him as the lion, but I didn't know him as the lamb. and I had to understand who God was properly for myself. The third thing I had to do was let go of my pain. And it sounds strange because pain is something that we don't want to walk with, but actually our pain can become our crutch. Our false identity can be something that is an excuse for self-pity, for sympathy, for excuses. And I had to let go of that. In order to change, I had to stop being fearful. I had to start putting myself in positions that were going to push me out of my comfort zone and make me do things that I wanted to hide from because I was so desperate to grow. And the last thing that I did was sought mentoring and counselling for myself. Pastor Anthony mentored me for just under 2 years, and it was a beautiful time of looking at the Word together and looking at identity together. And I also engaged in the counselling service here at ECC and paid for private counselling because I knew that to find healing, I had to find a safe and confidential space to open my wounds and to examine them, to pick them apart, to work out how that wound was formed, to work out how that wound was helped to grow and to stay raw. And I needed to go back and unpick it and understand it so that we could bring it wholeness out of it. These are the 4 things that have brought me freedom in my life. And your response to your pain is up to you. But you can begin that journey today. I spoke to Pastor Doug in the week and I said, Pastor Doug, we can't keep getting people to write their pain on stones and stickers and not see any change. And I have felt so burdened this week that we as a congregation, God's people, are walking with a sense of identity that isn't from God. We're walking around with things that we're trying to mask and hide because we don't want people to know how desperately broken we are on the inside. How unsatisfied we are, that we feel we're inferior, we feel like we're failures, we feel like we're broken. God wants to bring healing into this place because we are God's children. So this morning we have our wellbeing team in the room, we have the prayer team in the room, we have our elders in the room. I want to invite you today, if you have related to anything I have said, to open the door to your healing this morning. But know this, your healing probably will not be immediate. It will be an opening the door and you will have to journey. Your healing might be painful. And it's not about going back and beating anyone up from the past because we didn't put ourselves in the place of pain, but it's our responsibility to find our way out of the place of pain. And it will require your effort and your commitment. Sam's going to come and lead us in worship this morning. And if you've been impacted, then you can come to the front and we will support you and we will pray with you. But God wants you to be healed and whole. Thank you.
Good morning, church. This is Lois Lovell and this is Community Life News. The first announcement is the ladies' Zoom breakfast on Saturday the 26th of February, commencing at 9:30 and ending at 11. And our very dear friend Margaret Gordon is going to be speaking. Sign up on the website. The next announcement is about the creche. This is very important. The creche is now occupying the whole of the downstairs hall at the back during the service. This means you mustn't go down the spiral staircase because you won't get through the door. And also we don't want people going through to the toilets at the back. We want that area left contained. So could you please use the toilets in the front hall just behind the servery? Thank you. The next Kintsugi Hope group is going to start on Tuesday, the 1st of March at 7:30 to 9 o'clock on Zoom. If you'd like to be part of this group, please sign up through the office. The next Fellowship Sunday is going to be the 27th of February. This is when we invite you downstairs to have a coffee or a cup of tea and a miniature biscuit and mingle and have a little bit of fellowship before you rush off home. So please make a note of that, the 27th of February. In February, we have a theme, a topic of well-being. And under that umbrella, I want to tell you about 4 teams that we have. The first one is the Kintsugi Hope group, and they are offering this 12-week course relating to well-being. Consider doing that. The second thing used to be called the Listening Service and is now called ROFI, and this is our professional counselling service, which is available to everyone. We also have a new team, the Wellbeing team, and they're going to be focusing on training. And finally, we have the prayer team, who have existed for many years, and they are available every service to support us in prayer, and you can ask them at any time to pray. Tonight at 6 o'clock is our first wellbeing training for leaders, and so if you signed up for that, don't forget, click on your link and join at 6 o'clock. This is the Getting to Know You section. So I'm Lois Mary Lovell. I'm married to David. We've got 3 daughters and 2 grandchildren. I last summer retired from teaching. I was a biology teacher at a sixth form college. So when I was a child, I became interested in the living world, and I'm going to tell you 2 reasons why. First of all, we used to have a garden pond, and I used to spend hours investigating the pond. And in that pond were 2 of the 3 species of British newt, the smooth newt and the great crested newt. And they were very fascinating to me. The second thing from my childhood is we had a large brass Victorian microscope that came with slides, and one of the slides said ooze from 100 fathoms. And I looked at that slide and I could see shell fragments and diatoms, and that introduced me to the microscopic world. So also amazing. I left school after my O-levels and I got a job as a laboratory technician in a biology department of what's now Greenwich University, and I was there for 2 years, and I studied part-time on day release, and I studied science, and then I went off to uni. So that is a bit about me in the 60s and 70s, and today I really love gardening and growing things, and so that is me. So that's all the announcements for this week. Please stay in touch by looking at the website and following us on social media. Goodbye.